Thanks, Neil. The background to this talk was I came to one recently, and I said, oh, that was really fun. I'd give a Molotov sometime. And when I said that, I was thinking like way in the future. And then 2 days later, Neil calls me up. And he says, hey, so we don't have a speaker for next week. Would you give a Molotov? And then I was like, I don't know. I thought I was talking about 6 months down the road, and now you're talking about a week later. So I gave him two options, and I started asking, what do you think people would be interested in? I could do a topic related to the stuff I work on, computer science and neuroscience, or we can talk politics. And he was like immediately,
it wasn't that immediate.
Okay, it wasn't that immediate.
Topics.
Wasn't that immediate, but it was pretty quick. He said you should go for the politics. It'd be more fun. And I think he's right, because it's I tried to put in some stuff here that I think is topical in the sense that they're current issues and they're important for us because they're just big events that affect us personally, and then also they affect just the globe anyway. And you'll see what I mean. But as a kind of teaser, we're going to be talking a lot about inequality and income and wealth inequality that's out there in the world. It's gained a lot of attention recently from economists. Are there any economists here, by the way? Or people who study economics? Potentially, okay. So you can keep me honest here.
Probably not.
Probably, okay. Well. The Bart Simpson. What's this guy all about? So this is just the replacement for has anybody heard of the armchair philosopher? Yeah, armchair. This is like the replacement for the armchair philosopher. This is Bart Simpson in his room, looking at the world in his telescope. So that's kind of what we're doing here. So the big events. What's going on? Like if you read the news, you can't avoid these things. I don't know if you do pay attention a lot to the news, but these are just Brexit. Trump versus Bernie, that was a big thing. The Italian election happened, and now they've got, I don't know if you guys know what's going on in Italy, but they've got a government that's composed of sort of a really right-wing anti-migration government, and then a pretty left or undefined political entity that the leader of which started off as a sort of political comedian, like a John Colbert or something, Italian version of John Colbert. So now that's their government now. And it's causing a lot of turmoil in Italy. Decision making is sort of different decisions than usually would happen in Italy are being made.
You said John Colbert.
Steve Colbert.
Steve Colbert.
The malaprop. There you go. Yeah. So you're keeping me honest. So there's the Brazilian election that just happened, and they've shifted to the right. But it's not just a traditional sort of shift to right. It's something very different than they've picked. A very different selection of a leader than they've done in the past, and it seems out of the ordinary. And then generally, there's this surge of anti-establishment parties across the spectrum, right? all over the globe. If you look, there's just anti-establishment parties that are popping up in Europe and elsewhere, in Asia and elsewhere. So one question would be: are they linked? Is this are these just random events that are occurring? Just, the world's a complicated place. There's lots of complexity in the world, and this is just, we're taking a snapshot of the world and a lot of weird stuff is happening. Or is there like an underlying cause that's generating these events? Is there something that's linking this up? I'm not going to answer that because I think that's just way too big a question, but I'm going to present some ideas that might create some sort of unified way to think about it. Okay, so part of the trouble with thinking about things of this nature is that, when you have an argument, by the way, of those topics, who's had an argument or a critical discussion with your friends in the last year about one of those topics? Put your hand up. Okay, what about the last month? What about the last week?
Wait,
No, I'm talking about these ones. So these ones. Who's, in the last year, pick one of these, who's had a debate with somebody or an argument or discussion? Okay, so last month, lots of people, last week, still, probably the last day you talked about them. So, and I don't know if your experience was like mine, but they don't do that well. you don't really get to a resolution. Sort of like, even if you kind of agree with the person you thought you agreed, all of a sudden you're in like no man's land and you don't know why you don't agree, and it's kind of odd. And I think one explanation for that is that usually these discussions are amounting to discussing risk or some sort of like big consequence of some critical event. And I think that part of the reason it's so complicated to reason through these things is that we call these like local risks and global risks, okay? And these big ideas are all in the global risk kind of thing. This is not like geographical global, it's just like, there's a different kind of local global, but local risks are like, if you drive faster, you're gonna increase your risk of having an accident. Simple causality, right? It's like linear causality. Maybe it's not linear, but it's approximated by linear. Smoke more cigarettes, you increase your risk of cancer. There's just really simple causal link there. City funds a bridge with debt. It's really if they overextended and the debt comes to they come calling for the debt, and there's a default. It's localized usually within the city. It's not going to spread to like Austin debt collapse. It's not going to spread to Argentina, right? Poorly engineered building, the building collapse, then it's just kind of localized around the building. So these are local risks, local effects. The global stuff is really the interesting stuff that we usually debate about. And they are just a whole different can of worms with regards to risk and consequence and causality. So these are kind of real things. US raises the interest rates, so the Fed raises interest rates, and all of a sudden the factory in Senegal goes insolvent. And that's not just like a correlation. You could track that down and show causation there, right? But that kind of stuff happens. A typhoon hits Taiwan, and then all of a sudden there's a crisis in the US technology sector. That actually happened like around 2011. There was a region where a typhoon hit in Taiwan, which produced a lot of semiconductors, and that was just a critical part of the supply chain for the whole technology sector. So there was like a big disruption in iPhone 6 or 7. It was almost gonna not make it to the market because of that. That's just how linked up that market is. And Donald Trump's Twitter, probably heard a lot about that, but that recently did cause a financial crisis in Turkey, which then led to a financial crisis which is ongoing in Argentina, okay? So those are just...
Wait, tell us more.
Yeah. I will, so I've got a slide on that. So this is how that worked, right? So this is part of this global risk chain. So this was the tweet. I have just authorized a doubling of tariffs on steel and aluminum with respect to Turkey as their currency. The Turkish lira slides rapidly downward against our very strong dollar. And that's just true. So that's like, Donald Trump was looking at this, right? This event was right around here, this tweet. But he was looking at this and he's like, basically pointing out that's a fact, that the dollar is going up and the lira is going down. But he's now saying aluminum will be 20%, steel 50%. Our relations with Turkey are not good at this time. Immediately there's a downward spike in the value of the lira. And that's not really complicated to understand why that would be. I mean, does everybody kind of intuitively get that? Like, this is a threat on the Turkish economy. Investors are saying, who have their money in Turkey are like, this is just not good. They're going to be going toe-to-toe with a superpower. We better pull our money out, right? And by pulling their money out, these investors have their money stashed away and actually in the currency. So there's a currency exchange, the forex. So if as investors are saying, Turkey's not looking good, they pull their money out of that. They just stop investing in the lira, and then the currency value drops. That's just how that works. So that's simple. That's what happens. But then weirdly, there's this kind of like blip, and then it comes back up because investors are rational. They're like, investors are rational. He is probably not, and they're like, okay, we probably don't have to worry that much. So let's just go back to our baseline where the market was before. But all of a sudden, there's this big dip in the Argentinian peso, and it's just weird, but it's real. So if you looked into the details, what happened was there's all these big financial funds that are invested in both markets. So these are part of emerging market funds, right? And what happened was, because of this, those big funds started to think, the managers of those started to think emerging markets are not safe. They're not safe places to put our money in. And so they started to pull their money out of those. And then because these two things are linked by those funds, that created a crisis in the Argentinian peso. As you can see, the Argentinian economy was not doing very well over this period of time, but that shock just sent this drop, which is ongoing in Argentina. Now they were having this negotiation with the IMF to get some money, and then all those negotiations were starting to get renegotiated because of this blip. So it's just this huge mess because of a tweet, right? That might not even be that meaningful, but I think it just shows us how global these risks are, right? That everything's interconnected in kind of bizarre and strange ways that can't really be predicted in advance. And you know, this is like the real dark web, is like global finance. This is, probably heard a lot about this if you've read about the financial crisis, but this is just showing the cross-border financial flows. So these big funds, like big money flowing across borders. I called that the real dark web because, you know, it's just 12, this was just before the financial crisis, so this is $12 trillion that's going across borders, right? So if you think the global GDP is about 60 trillion, that's a huge amount of money, right? That's just kind of flowing around. There's just a lot of hidden risk within that huge amount of money. So, you know, when you're looking at this money, how much of it links the Middle East with South America? Well, nobody really knows because it's so densely interconnected. If there's a crisis in South America, that could easily propagate to the Middle East because their supply chains are linked or something. So the point is that, you know, a lot of people have connected this problem here with the financial crisis. So this is sort of the conduit by which the financial crisis propagated. There was a sort of local in the U.S. housing market that was a very big problem, that bubble burst. But because of this, it was able to like infect all markets all over the world, and that happened. So what you can see here was that after the financial crisis, those cross-border investments dipped, but it's back up, and it's not as high as it was, but it's sort of like just, you know, there's something very anomalous going on here, but it's just following that trajectory. So it's still high, and it's still, you know, if you believe that these risks because of this are there, they're still there. Right? There's enough. 5.9 trillion is enough to make it hurt.
Isn't it very hard to measure these?
The numbers?
Yeah.
I don't think it's hard to measure. I think.
Who's going to give you this data?
Oh, I think it's sort of data that is required to be registered. There'll be some missing. I mean, it won't be accurate to the $1 million level, or maybe even the $10 million level. There'll be some missing stuff there, but they'll be aggregated over regulated firms, like regulated funds. So big financial funds that do deals in like the $10 billion range, they just have to expose everything.
But there are people's private funds being.
So
that's
yeah,
going to be accounted here, right?
That's true. So hedge funds, there's some different kinds of funds, and some of them are more opaque than others. So it's true there could be something missing here. But I don't really know enough about finance. If anybody knows about finance, they could possibly answer that.
Yeah.
But
yeah, it would probably increase these.
It would increase, and also I think that to some extent the global financial system is regulated to some extent, and one of those is with information. So you have to sort of register a lot of things. So you can get estimates. It'll be from I guess McKinsey did this. They're a big consultancy, and they might have got the data from the World Bank. Or they might have got it from the IMF or the OECD or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. So is that like 12.7 per year or per month or what? Because you can directly compare stocks and flows.
Sure.
So like you say, USG or world GDP is like 60 trillion. That's like or I think generally that would be considered a stock, and this is a flow. So you have like the same money just going back and forth many times.
Yeah.
And if you count it every transaction,
absolutely, then
you're gonna add up, even if it's really just like $500 billion. I mean, there's obviously a lot more than $500 billion in like international monetary transactions, but like if you just had $500 billion moving back and forth many times, that would add up. And
yeah,
so
that's a good point.
Just saying that like it's compared to 60 trillion doesn't necessarily mean much unless you know the velocity.
The velocity of the money. Yeah, I agree. That's a good point. I mean, maybe that was wrong to put that on the same scale as the GDP, because the whole point in GDP is supposed to be counted once. That's kind of what you do when you sort of calculate GDP, factoring out all the other.
But it still makes, at least you can compare the order of magnitude.
Yeah, the order of magnitude is there, and then also I
I
think
mean,
really
the velocity can vary by literal orders of magnitude depending on economic
Yeah.
conditions.
Yep. So this big spike, might not have meant that's the same thing. This big spike could have come because there was feedback loops or something that was going on at this time that made it even more risky. Like, I guess I'm veering out of my
Or again, I'm saying
knowledge
like,
on the topic.
It could be the case that it's really only like a few percent of world GDP that is involved in all of these many transactions, and really the whole system. If all this like international stuff like collapsed, then it would only a few percent of world GDP is still quite a lot, but like that's what would be at risk. Or it could actually be the case that like 10% of world GDP is actually at risk from all of this.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. So that's not that isn't like a fifth of world GDP is at risk of
It's probably
that's not what happened there.
but a few percent of GDP moving around a lot.
Yeah, it could be. I think I guess the good part about this is just showing you that this was sort of like the peak of the mess, and it dipped and it dropped, but it's still high, right? So this is there's many risk factors. There's many factors that go into making the financial system at risk of collapse. If this is one of them, it's still pretty high. That's kind of this does act like a conduit because it links up economies that are geographically distinctive. Okay, so I want to get into talking about economic inequality, and as a potential kind of unifying principle that could be one of these risks that is sort of global and does have the potential to be, at least if we can't predict what's going to happen, we can identify that it's a problem and that it's consequential and widespread. So that's what I think. Why I think economic inequalities we're talking about or we're thinking about, because it's prevalent, as we'll see. I'm going to show some statistics. But just to point out that not everybody sees inequality as a universally bad thing. Okay, so and it probably isn't a universally bad thing. Maybe it is, but maybe it isn't, and I don't really know. But the potential upsides that often get cited are that if you have a situation of inequality within an economy, you can incentivize innovation. So if there's the potential to earn more and more and get more, you will work harder to do that. And if you don't have inequality, if there's no potential for having inequality, then people won't work harder because that's what motivates people is to gain more. And then also, people would argue that if you don't have inequality is just a consequence of some people working harder than others, and you should reward those people who work harder with more pay, and then that's going to lead to inequality. And this seems like there's some logic to that. And also other people, maybe people of a more libertarian bent, would say, well, with inequality is a product of a system that doesn't require too much state intervention. You just let things happen, and the system will settle into an equilibrium that is slightly unequal or very unequal, but maybe that's not great, but at least you don't need a strong state. You avoid all the problems that are associated with having a big, state apparatus to force to force equality, which seems to be true that you need governments to intervene to create equality. Potential downsides, though, on the other hand, are that if you have high degrees of inequality, then there's only a few people to innovate. Because most people don't have the resources that are required to do that innovation. They don't get the education because they can't afford it. All those things. If you have high levels of inequality, people can sort of work hard. It's like a hamster wheel. The hamster is working damn hard, but he's not going anywhere, right? So if you have a highly unequal system, then this might happen, and you could kind of see intuitively that it could. And then this one is sort of a big risk, and this has happened multiple times. Arguably, this was, kind of like World War II. This was what happened. Maybe, some people have suggested that. The French Revolution, literally, that actually happened. The Queen told the subjects to eat cake, and they said, no, we're going to cut your husband's head off. So that actually happened. And then, you got the Russian Revolution. So that's sort of like the worst downside, is that if you just don't pay attention to it at all, it gets so bad, and then people just revolt and they throw the yoke off. You've got a question?
Yeah, the eating cake bit, could you clarify? I just don't know the context from the French.
So the sort of French Revolution was, the people were very, it was a bad situation, a lot of poverty,
Right.
and there was a point in that build up towards the head cutting situation where
Right.
it's apocryphal perhaps, but there was a group of the mob who went to the queen and they said, they complained, and she said, let them eat cake. Like she was so
Well, they
oblivious.
said the people don't have bread.
The people don't have bread, and then she said, let them eat cake, right? And so it's just how oblivious she was to the plight of the common person. And she might have even thought that was a reasonable circumstance. That was a reasonable idea, that they could just get busy making lots of cake and keep them happy, right?
No, I don't think that's.
Or maybe she just didn't care.
So I have a slight aside about that.
Okay.
I think the cake thing that keeps getting cited is actually bad translation.
Mm-hmm.
That what happened is, so there was massive inflation, and to be able to battle with this, French economists, the monarchy, insisted on fixing the price of bread. But then selling that bread wasn't profitable anymore, so all the bakers switched to making fixing the type of bread that all the poor people bought. So they fixed the price on that. That bread everyone stopped making it because it wasn't profitable. They started making a more expensive type of bread for which the price wasn't fixed. So when they came to the king, to the queen, she was referring to, why don't they just eat the more expensive type of bread, not.
And that was the cake.
It was actually brioche.
Brioche, oh, it's a brioche.
Oh.
You see at La Madeleine and those places, yeah.
So we'll change that to let them make brioche. That's really, doesn't quite have the je ne sais quoi of it, let them eat cake, but, that's sort of the potential downside there. Okay, so the other thing, has anybody heard of the Laffer curve? Yeah. So this is kind of interesting. It's like a mathematical structure worth thinking a little bit about and bringing up in arguments. It's notorious because it was sort of it's notorious for a lot of reasons, but a lot of the reason it's notorious is that this idea was used in the 1980s by the Reagan administration to justify lowering the tax rate, and basically the curve expresses the relationship between tax rate and the revenue you get back from it, that you get back from taxing at that rate. And the intuitive idea of tax rate is like, well, if you tax more, you're going to get more, right? But if the more you tax at the higher rate, you're going to just get more money back, right? That would be like the intuitive notion, but it's probably not true, right? Because if you tax people so much, they just stop working because they're like, there's diminishing returns. If you're working hard, you're just getting taxed so much, then you stop working, and then you make
Or
less.
they work, but in ways that they hide their income.
Sure.
They have all sorts of.
You could be doing tax avoidance can pop up. So
I'm only going to work for cash.
Yeah. I mean, people just start focusing really heavily on how to avoid getting taxed, right? So it has this Laffer curve. It's a theoretical idea, right? That at some parts of this curve you can be up at the tax rate, but that counterintuitively you can lower your tax rate and make more money for the government. So that's what they sort of argued in the 1980s, the Reagan administration. And that's what they did. And I'm not an economist, so I can't tell you exactly what the effects were of that, but that's what they argued. People on the left said, left-wing economists would say it didn't work at all, it was a total failure. And then people on the right would say, oh, it's a genius idea.
Left-wing economists would say that lowering the tax rate did not work.
No, that
I
lowering the tax rate, had negative consequences by not being able to fund social programs.
Okay.
And because you didn't make,
Okay.
if you lower your tax rate and you make more money, ultimately you want to make more money. So if you lowered it and you made more money, that's fine, right? So there's just a debate here. So my guess is that you can really go out there, if you met economists, you could just ask them, what do you think about the Laffer curve? And if they tell you that they like it, then they're probably a conservative. And if they tell you that they hate it, then they're probably, a lefty. And if they say, It's an interesting idea. They might be a libertarian.
Okay.
Sorry, but the notion that most of the the things economists argue about are not really the kinds of things that people argue about politically, and for the most part, the big sort of economic ideas that people argue about politically don't really have there's just sort of there's pretty orthogonal to what economists think. There's some ideas that are associated with the left that economists think are good, and some that are commonly associated with the right, and some neither. But the big political split has sort of been resolved since the 70s or so. The whole saltwater freshwater thing is this. They sort of leftover idea in the popular imagination from the 70s, but not really how economists think.
So you're saying the economists don't think in
There's
terms
not
of-
really a split from conservative economists versus liberal economists on the Laffer curve. What exactly, which countries are on which side of the Laffer curve is generally agreed upon, the location of that.
Sure,
peak.
yeah.
What's the consensus and what do they?
I believe
do
at
they
this
agree?
point, very few countries are on the right side of the Laffer curve. When it became popular in the 80s, I believe more countries were on the right side, particularly in Northern Europe. Yeah, there you go.
So this is what actually happens, right? So just to be clear, for the Laffer curve to be, the correct model, these squares should all kind of line up on here, like Norway. Look at Norway. They're just, they know how to be fit by the Laffer curve. That's just perfect.
What are the axes? What kind of scientist are you, Calen?
Yeah, but
What's the axis?
I already defined the axis. You can't remember from the last slide. That's tisk.
Oh.
This would be tax rate, and this would be revenues as a proportion of GDP. So this
Why is the Laffer curve? Oh, okay. So that was a
Yeah, so I think
that was a simplified.
yeah, it's a simplified depiction, and it's. This is a model. The point is that there's some economic modeling that goes into getting out the Laffer curve, right? This is what if that under that hypothesis, that's what it would look like. And if that hypothesis is true and it reflects reality in the way that the world works, these boxes should really nicely line up there, but they don't, right? There's some structure that looks Laffer-like. It's kind of, as you go up, you see it kind of increase a little bit. Maybe you could argue there's something going on there, but it seems like it's equally as well predicted by a sort of linear model, right? And the linear model doesn't do a good job either. So really where you're kind of left is it's somewhere between an extremely bizarre Laffer curve model and a linear model, which means you don't know anything about what's
So
going
now
on.
in your case we can
The
agree
peak
that
of
Norway
Laffer
is
curve
doing
is
something
generally-
right.
Sorry, I believe the peak is not at Norway. It's much further to the right. At this point, most countries are sort of on the left, and that's sort of what you would get is that you have this sloping upwards if the actual peak of the Laffer curve occurs closer to 50 or 70 or 80%. Or something.
Yeah.
Like I said, I believe a lot of countries, like Norway as well as some of the other countries there, had at one point much higher marginal tax rates and have actually reduced them since the 80s or early 90s.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So when you say that the actual peak of the Laffer curve is to the right and at
Yeah, you see
50%,
that
what is that
bottom
curve
axis
there?
peaks about 50%. That's one way
He's
of
just telling
fitting
the
it.
fit. He's saying the fit is not correct. He's saying that the
Is that
fit
a
should be
fit,
more right.
or is that what the theory predicts for the Laffer
Looks like
curve?
I'm not sure how the OECD generated this exact. I guess what I would guess is that they took the theoretical model and then because the OECD doesn't really have a ideology, it's sort of just it's
Yeah, they may not, but American Enterprise Institute, which interpreted it and came up with this, graphic, they do have an ideology.
They do. That's true. But it looks like this. So yeah, I guess he's part of both institutes. The point is not really the point. The reason I bring up the Laffer curve is for a different reason, which is just to say that these kind of issues, they don't generally, they're not resolved by this kind of thinking, this linear thinking, which is what I think a lot of people tend to do, is think that you're either on an axis where less is worse or less is better, or more is good as more is better. And I don't think, just to talk about inequality, I don't think it's like that. It's not just like we can't just say we should have much less, we should have zero inequality because that might have negative consequences itself. And the Laffer curve, I think, is useful as a thought experiment to just show us that these kind of complex relationships do occur. Most things are kind of they're probably going to have some U-shaped utility function, and I think inequality is like that. But so now we're kind of getting into actual inequality statistics, and this is just about the top 1% of income earners since 1900. Okay, so this U-shaped function, it might be hard to see this, but this is the U.S., this is the U.K., this is Canada, Ireland, and Australia. So kind of developed economies. And since the 1900s, there was a drop in the share, right? So this is like you take the richest 1%, and you say, what proportion of the total income do they capture, do they have, right? And so now in the US, that group has 20% of all the income. And so since the 1900s, it was falling, but something happened in the 1980s where that's sort of there's just big upswing. So that's on there's the rising edge. And yeah, so that's with regards to the top 1%. It's only one part of the distribution, but it's an influential one, and it's gotten quite large. So it's interesting because we could dig deeper and we could talk about, well, what happened in the 1980s. You could get into like questions of policy and governments, and that's interesting. But I think this makes the point. This right here makes the point as well as I'd like to, which is that it is something that's under the control of governments to change. Okay, this kind of proves that because this is the same time period, but it's a very different function. And if you look at these countries, France, Japan, Spain, Netherlands, and Denmark, they just have a very different trajectory for how much the 1% is getting. That kind of shows that there's something that is under the control of policy with regards to how certain percentiles of the distribution get their money. Because these governments kind of have done different things with their policy than those governments. Okay, so that was just, what I showed you was just one small point in that distribution. This is a different way of breaking it down. Okay, so this is now looking at deciles. So it's the second would be the sort of lowest 20% of this is income. Well, it's the second. So and then this would be like they have more income than 90% of the population, right?
Wait. So x-axis is time.
Okay, so
y-axis is, what does that
so
mean?
this means indexed to 1974, meaning that everything is normalized to that for that group. It's all normalized to be for that decile. Their income.
What is being normalized? What's the raw?
The income. So it's real disposable household income. So it's sort of, this is an aggregate measure for households. Mm-hmm. So it's if you break the measure down to a household, it's saying what is the income of that household, and you would take at 1974, what's the average household income for the second decile, mm-hmm. and then you would so everything gets referenced to 1974, and then you ask how does that grow for those different deciles. At every stage, you divide by that amount in 1974 and just see how it's growing.
What
right?
is the unit on the vertical axis? Is it some
It
USD
would be
something?
percent, right? I think it's going to be a percentage, so it'll be.
Oh, growth. This is growth.
It's growth, right?
This is
so
the growth rate.
So right. So if you had 200, it'd be saying that the income of that decile since 1974 has doubled if it was 200.
Okay.
So in every point, you look at the decile of that time, or are you following the initial?
No, you remeasure. You'd say,
okay, what is the income of the second decile
what's the
now?
income of the second decile, and then you divide by the value of 1974. What's that?
Then the lines should never cross.
No, it can go up and then it can go. I guess it can go
So
down.
there's one line representing the first decile.
Yeah.
These
there's
are growth rates.
Yeah.
growth.
These
So-
are not the incomes themselves.
Yeah.
So
These
the
are gro-
incomes
yeah.
may be all
Oh,
sorted by
right,
color, but
okay.
the growth rates can cross each other.
So for these guys, it went up, and then for that decile, they dropped.
So what are we to make of this plot? The fact that it's spreading?
Yeah, the fact that it's spreading, so that at all income levels, it's fanning out, right? So another way to think about that would be that as time's going on, the distance between your sort of neighbor in income space is gradually increasing. So
So the growth rates are different.
they're
now.
yeah. I mean, so they started out, they're fanning out. So there's just bigger spread.
I think it's kind of interesting to point out that the bottom decile does get a bump though, right? Like they're sitting in their relative growth like above second, third, and fourth.
Yeah. Where? Right here?
Like once it gets to the, just towards the end, it seems to be like a relative intrusion.
Calen, is this is in the first chart, the second chart definitely not, but the first chart is the vertical axis logarithmic? Because to
No.
be fair, these things, you have to
It's
have
not.
that on a logarithmic chart. Do you see why I'm saying that?
To see.
Because you're comparing growth rates.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you compare growth rates, which are kind of multiplicative, you have to have a logarithmic chart in order to, because everything is kind of
But this is not the
multiplicative.
growth, right? This is the total growth.
It's
So at the end, it's saying that now the income of the first percentile in terms of 1974 thing is 115%.
Yeah.
yeah. I don't think it's not a rate.
Yeah.
So these are not amount of growth as a
So the
percentage of
overall
the
growth
previous-
rate since
No,
1974.
it's
Oh, I
a
see.
amount of growth reference to 1974.
Yeah.
So it's all anchored to it's a
It's not the
single.
growth rate that year.
But if everyone was growing at the same rate, then all the land will be.
They'd all be lined up. Yeah, exactly.
That's-
So they'd
that's
all
his
be
point.
growing in constant proportionality, but they're not. They're spreading out. And this is just for the United Kingdom. They had, I guess, more growth to do, but it's a similar pattern. So there's another. So
Can you go back?
yeah, of course.
Okay, so if the whole system, just imagine a whole system that's just growing, okay? Imagine a whole system that's growing. So everyone is growing, but the growth rates, the separations between their growth rates are also growing at the same scale. This is natural because the whole system is growing. So everyone's kind of growing. The separation is, you see how that looks like a scaling over time? The whole thing is just being scaled.
Mm-hmm.
It's like you put dots on a balloon and you blow that balloon up. Everyone grows, but they also get separated from each other. So here's a question regarding like the natural law of growth. Is it possible for everyone to grow but not separate from each other?
So this is,
Well-
the chart is saying is that the 90th percentile made, say in real terms, 40% more in 2013 than they did in 1974. And the, whatever, first decimal, so I say that, I should clarify. The 90th percentile made more, 40% more than the 90th percentile did in 1974. Those might be different people.
Yeah.
And the, let's say, 20th percentile in 2013 made whatever, 5 or 10% more in real terms than the 20th percentile did in 1974.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I understand. I'm just saying, is it okay to expect that for a system that's just growing everywhere, everything is being scaled?
No,
That
if it
you
was-
can
Oh, sorry,
pull
maybe.
down the spread?
The spread should be zero.
It
It's
should be-
perfectly distributed.
Yeah, if everybody's just growing at the same rate, it
Yeah,
would.
but what I'm talking about is some sort of a,
Question about growth.
He's literally
Like,
just asking whether it's
is it-
possible
is
that
it
all these
possible?
lines
Is it
will
not-
be the same line.
is it not a very artificial thing to try and distort a growing system?
No, but so this is right. So imagine everyone, everyone was getting paid $1 a day in 1974, or
Yeah.
well, or sorry, everyone's getting paid some amount in 1974,
Yeah.
and let's say there's and then like everyone gets a raise by like 30%, right? The difference in amount of extra money, you're right. The difference in extra money between neighboring people would increase,
Yeah.
but the percent of growth would be the same, right?
Yeah.
So in that completely unbelievable scenario, the line would be just straight for like the same line.
No, I understand.
Yeah.
My question was a more like philosophical one. Like, is it natural for a growing system to also have a growing spread?
Oh, I see. Is that just
growth?
yeah?
Yeah.
I see that question now. Yeah.
But wouldn't that contradict the earlier curve where we saw, I think it was like the top 1% of earners, their relative proportion of total GDP decreased for a while? Because I'm sure like GDP didn't diminish.
So,
over the
so
course
the
of
thing
this.
is that in all of these things, there's a mix of like natural law of economics, or there probably is something like that mixed with policy, because there's always policy and there's always choices that some government makes with regards to an economic policy at a national level that's going to impact this. So that's a huge, from what I understand in economics, that's a huge thing to try to parcel those out and actually understand the phenomena. If you're asking a question about a more like in natural systems that are under, say natural system where there's resource scarcity and there's competition amongst the organisms or the units, is it natural to expect this just general expansion of some of them, a few winners and lots of losers? I think it's plausible that that's what nature's like. You certainly see it in animal species. The walrus comes to mind. It's like one walrus, hundreds of walrus wives, stuff like that. You see those in epidemiology. You see things like that. So
I'll give you an example that I found
you got something in
interesting.
mind,
So
okay.
if you take satellite photos of the basins of rivers, like the drainage, the places where rivers start. So these are in the mountains, and the rain falls on different parts of the mountains, and they become streams, and they join each other and become bigger rivers. And you take a picture of this whole basin of a river, and then you do some analysis and try and find out the distribution of thicknesses of the different strands. So there are like 10 little strands of like little streams that are just trickling down the mountain, and then they're joining, becoming bigger, etc., until they're feeding into bigger rivers. And as you do this kind of analysis, you find always a power law of the distribution. So, and the power law arises from the fact that as you get bigger, your erosion capacity is going to get bigger, and you're going to flow down faster, and you're going to accumulate more. And this same thing happens in social networks. The more people you know, the more you're prone to knowing more people. And any system that's kind of has a positive feedback like that will have power laws. So you can go in and try and say, just take the analogy of the river and say, I want to more equally distribute the volume of water. Left to nature, this is what's happening, too much inequality. So, and then you could try and there's a role for policy to try and distort that I shouldn't use the word distort, but bend it out of the natural way. So when I looked at that and it looked like a scaling, there might be some sort of natural law there that if you just let things be, in order for there to be growth, the spread of growth will also grow at the same kind of rate.
Yeah, it's a really interesting idea.
Well, but then you're basing your assumptions on the fact that the market is truly it's not based on an incentive for a particular group or for a particular factor in the market. If you're thinking of the naturally evolving market, you're taking into account an idealized version where any policy that's being created at this moment will be sort of have negligible negative effects to all the companies or all the competitors in the market, which may not always hold true. And so there might be some variances in the growth rate or in your annual or like a decade thing. But I will agree to the fact that over a long period of time, you will see like a natural sort of dissociation for different groups in economies, because naturally the one who's doing the best will always keep on doing the best, or will find ways to be the best, versus the one who cannot find something to do will always be stuck there, because naturally for some reason.
Well, not just that, not just that they're doing well. They see my growth last year was 10%. They're not satisfied with that. This year they want to be at 12%. And the more you have grown, the more power you have to increase your growth. So
I think
it's
that's
like an accumulation.
I think that
and you'll see this reflected in all derivatives. I think it's exponential. So So we're talking about two derivatives here.
It's
Yeah.
it's a really interesting question. I mean, it's maybe it's a little bit beyond try to answer that's a bit beyond. I don't think I have the data here to speak to it. It's
Yeah.
it's a really fascinating question. I mean,
But okay, so the thing that power laws have a lot of derivatives, and all their derivatives kind of act the same.
mhm. The scale invariance.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think the another implication is that whether it could be natural or it could be non-natural, right? It could be non-natural in the sense that it's a policy that's actually facilitating it. Either there would be equality otherwise, but policy helps to make it unequal. Or it could be that it's actually natural, and policy is doing the other thing. But a question you just want to ask, since we're rational people, we can say, is it actually harmful? And either if we answer the question that it's harmful or it's to be avoided or we should worry about it, either way you figure out policies that would either decrease it or control it to some extent. I think, but that's really interesting.
So in the plot for the United Kingdom, is the income, well, I'm assuming the income is in their own currency, which will be pounds.
Mm-hmm.
So-
Real, so
Huh?
the real should take care of that.
Oh,
It really was comparing it to itself.
to itself. Oh, okay.
Yeah, I mean, are you wondering why it's so big?
Well, yeah, my question was going to be, it seems like the median for the growth for the United Kingdom seems to be much higher than the one for the US, but they have a different conversion. It's not 1-to-1. So I was wondering if you scale one to the other, do you see that is the US getting richer than the UK in terms of the median income, or are they still the
Yeah, the US is
hovering
much
around?
richer than the United Kingdom, even after this.
Even after?
Yeah, I
okay.
mean, and this is household income, so it would be like
all sorts of reasons happen with households.
yeah. I mean, the U.S. has many more households, so overall the economy is much larger in the U.S. But this is per household, so it's like the U.S. doesn't have the highest household income in the world. There's a number of countries, I think it's up there. There's not that many, but I think Canada's above the U.S. and I think
I know the UK is not one of them.
the UK is not one of them. But this is also over a period of time, and I think it depends how those economies were doing relatively at that point. So if the UK had more, the UK was doing poorly in 1974 and had a long distance to go, and then they had room to do a doubling, whereas the US may not have had room to double their household income over that time period. I would guess that's what explained that, but I'm not completely sure on that.
I remember when we, I think my first macro class, actually sort of constructed this model that showed that you expect kind of like states or whatever regions with the lower GDP will have a higher potential growth rate. And then we looked at some data showing that like not all poor countries have a higher growth rate, but like it's certainly good. Basically, all of the countries with a higher growth rate are poorer to begin with.
Yeah, there's going to be a ceiling like once you there'll be some kind of ceiling once you get up high enough. Once you're so wealthy, it just becomes harder to increase. But yeah. Okay. Any other comments? So those two measures of inequality, we talked about the 1%, and then we broke it up into the deciles. Those are sort of two different ways of thinking about inequality. Another method that's used, which is potentially more powerful in some ways to do comparisons, is something called the Genie Coefficient, and it's worthwhile knowing what this is. You might, if you get interested in this topic and doing more reading, the Genie Coefficient will come up all the time. But it's a pretty simple and elegant idea. And what you do to create your Genie Coefficient, by the way, a coefficient just means a single number that's going to summarize inequality. In this case, it's going to be a number between 0 and 1, or if you scale 0 and 100. But now it's a single number that tells you it's an inequality index, right? And here's how you do that. You rank your population on the x-axis. So this is the cumulative share of the population. So this would be the bottom 10% of your population, okay? And then you ask, for your bottom 10%.
Bottom means like poorest. numbers.
Poorest 10% of your population. And you say, what proportion of the total income available in that economy or region or whatever scale you're looking at, what proportion of the income do they have? And if there's perfect equality, what you have to have is this straight line. So that would be that if you go 10% of your poorest, they have 10% of your income. 20% would have 20% of your income. So that would be this theoretical line of equality, which is just never going to happen, but at least you can construct it. It's an idea.
I just realized there's a, okay. But this is only in the edge case where everyone earns the same amount. How do you even sort them?
Oh, right. It's undefined, right? It's an undefined.
Yeah.
It's an undefined. But you can
But,
then randomly select. And
If you have a
still-
system in which everyone earns approximately the same, or very close to the same, and you sort them, you're still going to get something that's roughly close to the same.
Yeah, I mean
Yeah.
it's just I mean you're a physicist, so those kind of things happen. But in the real world,
Yeah.
those kind of things never happen. There's always an ordering.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I apologize.
No, it's good. It's good. You got to keep us honest.
There's a great Kurt Vonnegut novel in which he talks about a world where everybody is forced to be equal. So it's a good read.
So that Vonnegut book, that's Vonnegut's book.
It's like the smart people have to have
Devices that like
Like,
prevent
I
them
mean-
from being able to concentrate.
right, and yeah, I mean like.
What's that?
Which one was it?
Devices?
So that if you have above average intelligence, the government plants this little thing in your brain that you actually start to like think about something, it goes off and like distracts you, prevents you from concentrating.
Okay, what I would do is like Uber or Airbnb. It beams that extra CPU power to people who don't have it. And then you can be reimbursed in cryptocurrency.
There's a blockchain
There's a blockchain solution. That's where you come in.
Problem is like no number.
If you're willing to share your intellect, you can have money.
Yeah, we have a much more efficient system for that.
Yeah. So this is your line of perfect equality, and then you actually go out and you measure what does the distribution actually look like, right? And it's always going to be something like this. It doesn't have to be this shape. It could be anything, right? But it has to be increasing like that and end at 100. So you can measure the area in that. So the most unequal situation would be that all these people have nothing, and there's just one guy with everything, right? And so that would be there, and you measure the area under there. It'll be, well, if it's just one, let's say 2 people, right? There's going to be some area. That means that there's
No,
just
even if it's just one person, it's going to work out to be like.
yeah.
one.
That'll be
It's
it'll
one.
just right. You can do it with one person, but you're going to have very small area, right? Or very large area, because this is going to be pulled all the way over here, and you're going to have a large area in A. So that would be a highly unequal society. On the other hand, if it was kind of tightly hugging the line, as you go up in the percentile, you stay close to that line, you're going to have a very small area. And when you do this, when you take when you divide A by A plus B, you get a single number that's just sort of reflects the amount of area in A. And that's your index. So that'll be your Genie coefficient that you can compare. It's not perfect. It's not a magic bullet to tell you whether a society or whether an economy is good or bad. It's just it is what it is. It's just it's an approximation that tells you something about, because you can just see it intuitively. It catches some aspects of this notion of inequality, and you can use it to compare. So here's I took the Genie. Are we running out of time, by the way? Is that?
No,
No.
there is no time.
There is no time.
That must make physics really hard.
So
I just want to point out, I pointed this out before. If you go into some of these rooms in the physics department, they're designed like a casino. No windows, no clocks. The clocks. Okay, so this clock
Clocks run
works
backwards.
now, but because I've been booking this room for many years, well, several years, the clock keeps breaking down and then taken off the wall. And my suspicion is the reason that you have no windows and no clocks in casinos is people forget how long they've been in there.
That's exactly why they do that.
Yeah, and I think the psychology is the same here. They don't want you to know how much of your life you're spending in RLM.
Sage words.
Yes.
Start with watch.
So this is, these are all the, if you take all the Genie coefficients for, so here what I did is I took the bottom, however many are here, the bottom, the most unequal across the world you find however many of these there are, and you just plot them with their Genie coefficients. So that kind of gives you an idea, like, you know, these are the range. It's not coming up very.
Higher means more unequal.
More unequal. Yeah.
That percentage must be right.
Yeah, it's a percent. Yeah, it's a percent. So, I mean, 100 would be on this scale, 100 would be the maximum. So it just kind of gives you some reference. These are the worst, you know, countries measured by Genie. And, you know, I've been to some of these countries: Nicaragua, El Salvador, Colombia, Mexico, Nicaragua. And they're not Panama. They're not bad countries. I mean, they were lovely to visit. So it doesn't, you know, being very low on inequality or being very high inequality doesn't mean that the country is a no-go place. But I mean, they do cluster. All these countries have structural issues in them. There's social unrest. They've gone through periods of flux, many causes. But you know, this is the high inequality club. And if you look at the growth in inequality of the United States, measured by the Genie, since, you know, this is, I guess, I can't even read. That's 1950. First measurement is, yeah, around the 1970, late 1960s. And so if we just fit a linear model to that, which, you know, might be dangerous, but it's the simplest thing we can do, and then you just extrapolate. Let's play fantasy land and just look what would happen if we extrapolated to 1950 and we just let inequality run, right? We didn't change any policy and just let it run. The United States by 2050 would hit sort of the levels of inequality of some of these countries. And you know, that's just, I mean, first of all, it's extrapolation. Lots of things could change, policies could change. Maybe there's, you know, economists might even have already figured this out, that that's just not really possible for an economy like the United States. It just can't go up that high. Something would have to change. But you know, this kind of shows you the trajectory that we're on, and the stakes at play is that if you just let things run, and they can run out of control, we're getting up to, you know, by today's standards, some of the highest, most
If you
unequal
look at the
places.
last 5 or so points, there's actually a pretty significant dip.
Yeah, so that, I mean, you know, when I made this, I saw that, and you know, I wanted to say, oh, they're outliers, which they actually are, but I thought that was like cheating and unfair, so I left them in. But this is the financial crisis, and this is the financial crisis. This trend has continued as it's been measured more finely. It's ticked back up. So I mean, that's a good point, but that, I don't think anybody out there is saying this is what's happening.
Yeah.
When I've read into this
That wasn't premeditated policy.
No, this was financial crisis stuff, and you know, it's not. It's everything that made this is still there. So and it's most people suggest it's just getting worse. The factors that led to this, whether you think it's good or not, the factors that led to this are still persisting. So it's, you know, there's no reason to think it's not going to continue, at least in the short term. Yeah.
So, probably 2 comments. So Canada seems to have less measurements for their Gini coefficient, or the thing. But even though they have fewer measurements, their data points seem to be clustered more closely than US does. So does that reflect on the economic policies that Canada has versus what the US has, or is it unfair to sort of treat a Gini coefficient as a sort of reflection on what the economic policies would be for that country?
No, I think
or
you
in
can-
terms of economic status for that country.
Yeah, I think you can definitely do that with the Gini. You can definitely say, you can go into those things and say, oh, look, the Gini dropped because of some, you know, you could look at some covariance with the policy and see that's definitely fair game. Regarding the density of points, I think that's going to be a factor. It's going to be a fact that these are different data sets. You know, it's just, it might be census census data, or I'm not sure where it's compiled. I think these are actually measurements that I got from, Index, and there are a number of different methods that were used to calculate, another number of different data sets that tried to interpret the Genie coefficient using different data. So it's actually an average of a number of data sets, averaged into different numbers. And yeah, so those are just, different publications, different authors they try to compute a Genie coefficient for a country at a different year than another country. And there's way more data points for the United States because people care a lot more about the US than Canada. We're tiny country. We're like a fly on the back of an elephant. So,
Are you really?
Yeah.
No
So-
Canadians here, right?
So that's, I think that's, and then your second question was really about whether you can use it as a way to understand policy decisions.
Yeah, because at a very simple one-to-one correspondence, it feels like Canada's doing something right, because the inequality, there is inequality in Canada as well, but it seems to be clustered around the 20 to 40% region, versus US seems like, if you're born at the right time or earning at the right year, then you have more money, versus in, I don't know, 2000 you're earning probably less money because it's a very unequal society. So is there something for the US or possibly countries with like very fluctuating Gini coefficients to learn from Canada?
Oh yeah, I think definitely. I mean, I don't think Canada's even the country to learn from. It would be, there's other countries that are better than Canada on Gini. Netherlands, Denmark, Sweden. Those are good Gini countries. Like they have low inequality. Canada's doing pretty good, and it is a policy. I mean, Canada does have So the United States is also one of the it is, I think, the most unequal country in the developed world. So the big developed economies, it's highly unequal in that cluster. And I mean, that's a big discussion, I think, why, right? I mean, everybody's gonna have different opinions. There's a whole other talk, but it's a more free market country. There's less regulation could be a factor. There's maybe I'm not sure if this is true, but the inheritance taxes matter. So if you have more inheritance taxes, then it's harder to pass on. If you have more inheritance taxes, it's harder to pass on your wealth to the next generation. And then that's going to lower inequality because, the persistence of wealth in your family lineage is going to be harder to. So there's a lot of factors that are going to play. Exactly what those are in the United States, I think it's a big question. It's worth thinking about, though. So this one, I think this slide is kind of interesting and fun. So. And there's food for thought here. So this is the annual growth in I guess it's going to be I want to say it's going to be income. I think I should have wrote that down. Yeah, income. So as you go up in the income percentile, so these are the people the lowest incomes, and these are the people here with they have the highest incomes, right? So we want to look at, since 1980, how much growth in income has that percentile seen? We already kind of looked at data similar to this before, but you see it's pretty slow going, and even for the lowest guys, like after tax, they're doing okay, which I guess is probably the really the relevant one. But post tax, they're seeing a very modest increase in their wealth, and it's gradual. As soon as you get up to the the 95th percentile, it's they're seeing a big increase in their income. Annual average growth of their income.
Pre-tax, post-tax, doesn't matter.
No, pre-tax, post-tax doesn't matter. They're getting tax breaks. Doesn't matter. But I mean, the reason you got this pre-tax and post-tax in here is just because tax is one of those tools that governments can use to sort of equalize these things. So
but it's affecting only the poorer people.
Yeah, I mean, because that's really it's a pretty cold government that just will make their tax policy without the poor in mind, right? That's really the point of taxes.
But I mean, the growth. So when you say post-tax, that blue line, that's That's growth in the post-tax income.
Yeah, annual
compared to
in their
the
post-tax.
So
yeah.
that's better, actually.
Yeah, it's better. Yeah, so it's so. But I mean, I think one thing I want to point out, which is kind of interesting, is that if you look at inequality scales, in other words, so if you look at, if you're in the 50th income percentile, you're looking at your neighbor in the 55th, right? Well, their growth has been comparable to your growth, right? And so you might be irritated because you're kind of like, you're looking around you all over here and you're like, I'm not growing as fast as my neighbors, but I would like to. Now, if you're up here, if you're a millionaire, you're somewhere around here, you're looking at your millionaire, the people next door who are just, maybe they got 2 million, all of a sudden they've got 4 million. So it's just expanding, right? So up at the top. So there's inequality even at the top. And it's kind of interesting. Nobody talks about that. I've never heard anybody talk about that fact. But if you really think about it, that's going to be driving some interesting stuff up there. We don't really talk to, you don't talk to millionaires that often, but I think it'll be driving their psychology. Right? And it'll be driving their psychology. They're the hungriest of the hungry. So if they're experiencing inequality in their bracket, they're going to want to, do something about that. I don't know if people study that, but this is actually, if you just look at this is where there's the most inequality by a certain, weird way of looking at it.
But this kind of comes back to the derivative stuff that I was talking about. I think in natural systems, the way that the dynamics works, okay, not all natural systems, but in some, and definitely this one, is that incentives are set up all relative. We have got a dopamine circuit that only cares about differences between expectation and reality. That's where happiness comes from. And in those systems, I feel like what you take for granted is always changing. So at some point it could be, oh, I just want to make enough of a living for myself. And then you're only caring about the absolute income. And then when that's assured, you start thinking about, no, I want to now grow because my neighbors are growing.
Yeah.
And when that's assured, you want to say, no, my growth rate has to increase every year because that's what's happening. So it's just this, so I feel like it's not surprising to see power laws kind of fall out of those things.
Yeah.
Where you find derivatives everywhere.
Yeah.
All sorts of derivatives following the same
So
trend.
think about it, like that power law. I think you're right. That power law property is part of this effect. But it's sort of like if you're sitting in here, where a lot of people are, and you go into a party and you're about to socialize with people, and you're like, that guy has more than I do, but he's got what I make 60 grand, and that guy makes 90 grand. He's no better than me. He can't tell me what to do. You're over here and you go to a party, right? And who you hang out? You don't hang out with schlubs in the 50s, right? You hang out with other people here, right? And now all of a sudden you're at a party where you got 10 million, and then you talk to a guy who's got 90 million, right? It's like,
and he's already putting his consciousness on the computer.
Yeah. He's ensuring his immortality by investing in some Peter Thiel fund for billionaires to cryogenically freeze your, whatever. Or it's even worse if you're a billionaire. Those poor guys. You walk into a room and you only hang out with billionaires, right? Or maybe 100 millionaires. And there's just like a billionaire in that club is not even that much because there's 10 billionaires, there's 20 billionaires, there's 30 billionaires, and the difference between that is just enormous, right? So, and those are the people who really equate value with worth, right? That's why they've gone through this whole process, because they think that money is what defines who you are. I want to shed a tear for those guys.
So I was reading this book about Elizabeth Holmes, the Theranos ex-CEO, and apparently one of her great strengths was she could identify the people who were just like that, who were fairly high net worth, but they were feeling like, that hey, that is, Silicon Valley startup founder is just, going through the roof. So George Shultz, Henry Kissinger, these are people whose net worth was very good to begin with. But they invested like crazy in her, ideas, which were wacky as heck, because they wanted to be like Bill Gates.
I don't know if people know that story. You could
Oh, Has
I don't know if
anybody,
everybody
I
else-
would have thought everybody, okay.
I know person.
Oh, okay. Theranos, it's like just a crazy story. This 19-year-old Stanford dropout, she started a medical blood testing company, and which has just completely crashed, and it's like a complete fraud. But she managed to get these people who were like George Shultz is credited with winning the Cold War for the U.S. Henry Kissinger is considered this great sage. So these are extremely cautious, very really
She got
savvy
the money from
people.
Rupert Murdoch as well.
Right. Very savvy people, and they all bought into her completely insane ideas. And
It was on-
honestly, the best way I can I can't describe it. There's like a YouTube video.
The initial ideas weren't insane, but when it turned out they didn't really work, they just turned into like massive fraud. I mean, they were ambitious, but I don't think they were completely crazy.
I don't know
When
what's his
they-
name, John Kiraku, or no, whatever his
Yeah,
name
the
is.
guy from the Washington
The Wall
Post.
Street Journal.
Wall
He has
Street.
several talks on YouTube. Yeah, I just recommend going
It
through.
really was crazy the fact when their ideas started not to pan out, they just turned to complete and utter fraud in order to pretend like things were still working.
Well, I mean, his contention is, and the people in the biological sciences were always very leery of the idea that these
Yeah.
ideas would work at all. So they were apparently crazy to begin with. Anyways, yeah, but her strength was,
Okay.
honing in on those insecure people.
So I'm gonna skip this one because I'll just go to one last idea, and I think this is pretty powerful one. It's pretty interesting, and I don't know what it I don't know if it says good things about the future, but it kind of we can ask the question of what's one of the generating factors in inequality. And some people have suggested, and this is providing evidence for this, is that what's driving inequality, or one of the driving things for inequality, is that there's been a lot of technological progress in the 20th century. And technological progress is something that is bound to lead to inequality. As technological progress goes on and takes over the jobs that humans traditionally do, that means that you can either pay humans less, so you can pay the people who don't have the education or can't build the machines, or don't have some critical component managing the machines or something like that, just most of the population, you don't have to pay them as much because the thing that they can do can actually be done by a machine, can just be replaced by a machine. Or it means that you don't need to hire as many people. People just aren't making money because they're not needed. The machines can do what humans can do. And this is kind of arguing that is in fact what may be happening currently, what's going on. So this black line here is the steady march of GDP. So that's just, it's going up, blip here, I guess, financial crisis. And I guess this is US GDP. And so then you look at the corporate investment in equipment and software. Okay, so that has also been steadily increasing. And then you look at the profits after tax have been soaring. So this is corporate profits. And employment has been going down. As a proportion of the population, employment rates have been going down. So this is sort of suggesting as investment by firms in equipment and software has been sort of keeping pace with the growth that's happening in economies, but labor's share of the growth is dropping. So there's less employment. So firms need less people because they're investing in software and equipment. And I think this is just interesting because this is a trend that's bound to continue. I mean, I think we can see it all around us that technology is just it's becoming more of a factor in the economy, and more industries are going to be automated for sure. And I think this is a huge thing that that's why inequality, I think you have to think about it, because it's about to happen. If we don't have a plan, if inequality, if it really is central to a lot of problems that are occurring, like to go back to the first slide, if inequality is related to that, and this and this is true, which, I mean, I think there's a good case that can be made that technological progress and automation is linked to that, then we're in real trouble, because there's just no way to stop technological progress. And if that's linked to inequality, the only thing to do would be policy, I think, or some brand new kind of ideas that come from some other direction.
But there's another idea too. I mean, there's also the fact that it's not even that people will be phased out entirely. It's that some people just won't even be able to learn the technology to get the job, so they'll find somebody that already knows it or that could catch on quickly. Because it's a matter of like, where are the people in society that know the technology versus people that don't, and how, or whether they can learn it or not. So there's even that component too. Because in my profession, we use a lot of technology, the teaching profession. But a lot of adults that I work with, they have the hardest time learning that, but they have other skills that supersede their technology parts. But they know going out there now, they're going to be faced with that problem of not knowing the technology and having the hardest time learning it.
I think that's just part of the problem that it seems to me that if we don't think about it at all, if there's no and people, it is a big political
That's
issue.
just in one generation. I feel like people who are like older in this generation, the world has changed a lot, technologically speaking, from back when they were students and learning skills. So if they don't have a job now, it might be hard for them to be integrated in a world where they would have to learn a lot of like new skills. But the pace at which technology changes is itself increasing. It's kind of exponential now. So within our lifetime or in the next lifetime, there would be so many changes required in one lifetime that maybe if this continues and there are no policies and you have to constantly keep yourself employed, you have to kind of reinvent your skills every decade, maybe every year, eventually, I don't know.
Yeah. That puts a lot of burden on the workforce.
Yeah.
So if just to stay productive, just to stay a part of the workforce, you need to constantly be reinventing your skills or adapting your skills to the economy.
But there are other forces as well. For example, technology. When I first started learning how to use the computer in school, there used to be like a manual and there used to be classes. These days, no one looks at an operator's manual before they use Instagram. So the technology itself is being designed such that the learning curve is as shallow as possible. So it's a lot of stuff at play.
There is a lot, there's definitely a lot of stuff at play. I think these are just things to keep in mind. But that's it. That's the Maltov.